Hey viewers, my name's Kara. I'm your host for Tuesdays here on the Pagan Perspective, or Wednesday if you're in a very far east time zone. This week we are talking about stuff that it's okay to do in our respective paths. This week's topic comes from Jenny, who asked us to cover some of the common "is it okay blank" questions that they've been seeing people ask online. And then I thought we could also take that a step further. I think this was maybe Jenny's intention, having us go ahead and think of some other common "is it okay" fill in the blank questions that relate to our paths specifically, so that we're all coming up with some different questions to answer this week as well. So to begin with the examples that Jenny gave starting out, the topic will be in the description of this video as always. But some of the main questions that Jenny's been seeing that are typed in this topic suggestion are: is it okay to buy my own tarot deck? Is it okay to have a temporary altar? Is it okay to keep my altar in a box / in the cupboard / in a particular room? And so on. So I want to answer those almost in order, but I have a list here of some other ones that are pretty common that people ask me, or that people ask about types of practice that are similar to my own path and practice. So first, is it okay to buy my own tarot deck? This is definitely a common one, and I do read tarot cards, so this is relevant to my path and practice. It is okay to buy your own tarot deck, in my opinion. The reason that it is good to get one as a gift, I think, is twofold. One of which goes along a little bit with the next sort of related question that I'm going to bring up. So I'll just talk about the more specific tarot reason first. Someone in one of my communities was recently talking about this and mentioned that the intention behind that is for someone that you know who knows you, who already reads tarot, to choose a deck that they feel would be right for you and your energy and would be helpful for you to learn. And then being gifted that with that context is, it's a very personalized, special gift for you to kind of start your journey with tarot. Whereas a lot of people, they just hear this, you're supposed to get your first deck as a gift thing. And so what happens is people will go into a shop with a friend or a member of their family, and they'll just pick out a deck and they'll have their friend or family member or whoever buy it for them, so that technically it's a gift. But the person who is paying for it isn't necessarily the one picking it out for them. They're not choosing it for them based on, what they know, and that person doesn't necessarily read tarot themselves, whoever's buying it. So the intention behind where that kind of came from is sort of lost through people just hearing, you're not supposed to buy your own tarot deck kind of thing. But yes, in my opinion, it is okay to buy your own tarot deck. Not everyone has someone in their lives who is willing or able to gift them a deck. So if that's the case for you, you really want to get into reading tarot and can't imagine asking anyone to get one for you, you may get it yourself. So the second reason I think we say things like, getting things as gifts, the next related question that I have that I think is pretty common is it okay to buy my own tools in general, like tools of the craft? I was definitely first introduced to the idea when I was a baby witch. I was a preteen and then a young teen at the time when I was first starting to study and practice. I was definitely introduced to the idea that we are supposed to wait, be patient, and receive tools as gifts. And as I got older and a little more involved in the community and also talking to people about it online, I came to the realization and the understanding for myself that I think the reason we give that advice to beginners, to people who are new to studying these things, is mainly to discourage people from thinking that you have to go out and spend all this money to acquire a bunch of items before you can start studying or practicing. Because that's not the case. You can start with things that you have around your home. You can start with things that you've gathered from nature. You can make your own tools to start out with. So that's kind of what I think it is discouraging the thought process of, oh, in order to be a witch, I have to buy all of these things. My personal advice is start with whatever you already have lying around the house or that you can get for free, or maybe inexpensively at a thrift store. I love thrifting. And start with that. And then once you determine whether or not you really even want to have those specific tools or items, then you can think about saving up to buy maybe a more costly version of it. But so that's why I think it comes in. Like, yes, it is okay to buy your own tools. I believe the reason we give the advice is to discourage people from running out and getting things too quickly. Because I've also seen a lot of people online these days that they'll go and acquire a shiny, fancy version of a thing because they think it's what they're supposed to have. And then they'll post a pretty picture of it online saying, hey, I finally got my, fill in the blank, whatever the thing is. And then they start asking people, so what am I supposed to do with it? And in my opinion, that's just a little bit backwards, because I can't imagine why we would want to go and spend money on things before we even know what they're for, before we even know if we would personally want to utilize them in our practice. So it's okay to buy your own tools, but I also understand why we give that advice, and I think it's good advice for that reason. The next one from the topic was, is it okay to have a temporary altar? Yes, it is. And a lot of the books that I read first when I started studying and practicing talked about that. So this is something that I wonder if it's a matter of people reading these things in different sources and just wondering if those sources are credible, or if maybe people aren't reading those resources that say that it is okay and it's just a discussion that's come up online, and so people are wondering if it's really okay. Yes, it is okay to have a temporary altar, and by that I think the person or the people wondering this probably mean like the type of altar that you keep your items kind of stored away, and then whenever you need to do a ritual or a working, you unpack those items and set up your altar and do the thing you're gonna do, and then when you're done, you pack it all back away. Absolutely, that's okay. I did that, solely that, for several years, and I still have some altars to this day that are not permanently set up. The next questions from the topic about altars were, is it okay to keep my altar in various places, such as in a box, in a cupboard, in a particular room of the house? Yes, I think so. These are things that might differ. Like if you're part of a specific tradition and they have a specific tradition concerning doing certain things with your altar, then maybe you want to follow that. But as far as your personal practice is concerned, yeah, you can keep your altar tools in a box when you're not using them. I know some people keep their altar sort of permanently set up in a box that they can then open the lid and it's already basically set up in there. Or similarly, people will do that in a drawer that's big enough to house their items so that you can just pull out the drawer and your altar is in there. It's a good way to keep it out of harm's way if you have animals, if you have little kids, anything like that. I know there's lots of different things that people have done in that regard. And as far as keeping it in a particular room of your house, I think that's totally up to you and what the altar's for. I think, for example, if you consider yourself mainly a kitchen witch, it makes sense to have your altar space in the kitchen, but even that doesn't mean that you have to. I have altars all over my house, depending on what they're for. So yeah. And then the last question that Jenny included in the topic was one that really boggled my brain recently, she says, was, is it okay to cut my own hair? And this strikes me because I'm wondering, is that a witchcraft or paganism question? Or is that just like a random question that someone had that they were asking in pagan and witchy communities online? Because we have talked about the spiritual significance of hair before, years ago on the collab channel, because there are certain cultures that associate, the length of someone's hair with their personal power. So there are certain cultures where people grow out their hair, facial hair, whatever the case may be, for religious reasons. So I don't know if maybe this question is coming from that sort of thing, but in my opinion and in my life, yes, it's okay to cut your own hair. I indeed did cut my own hair quite recently. I did have partial natural light when I started recording this video. I apologize, now it looks quite a bit darker. We'll get a little lamp on and I'll also try to lighten it up in editing. That'll help us a little bit. So now we're just on to all of the rest of the questions that I came up with as things that people ask about that are relevant to my personal path and practice. So the first one is actually related to the topic that we did last week. So you can just go and watch my video from last week, but I think a pretty common question about the type of witchcraft that I practice is it okay to self-initiate or to do a self-dedication ritual? In my opinion, yes, it is. It serves a different purpose than an initiation into a group or into a tradition as a whole, but it is okay to self-initiate as far as like your own path, your own practice, to acknowledge personal milestones and things like that. So you can hear more of my thoughts about that and a little bit about my personal dedication that I did back at the beginning of my practice in the video that I did last week here on the channel, and I will link it at the end of this video in the end screen as well. But that's a pretty common question, I think. The next one I have is it okay to make your own spells or your own rituals? Yes, it is okay, and in fact, in a practice like mine, it is often preferred. It is definitely encouraged. I have, as I mentioned in my video last week about my dedication ritual, I have definitely done rituals that are right out of books before, and I think that's okay too. But as far as like, I haven't heard this conversation come up a lot in recent years, but especially years ago on YouTube and elsewhere on the internet, people were talking about like, you know, is it better to only do pre-made rituals that someone else has written, or is it better to only do your own? And so I do both. It just depends on what it is, but it is okay to me to do either one. In my personal path and practice, it is not okay to do either. It just depends on what you want and what you need. Because even if you are using a ritual that someone else has written and published in a book, you know, they wrote it. So how much different is that than you writing your own? The difference might just be the amount of experience that that person has that led them to being able to write that ritual or spell as they have done it. And you might not feel ready to do that if you're like right at the beginning of your practice. So for me, I started with following scripts out of books. I think that's a fantastic way to learn. Over time, as my practice grew and evolved, as I felt a little more comfortable with certain things, I explored starting to write my own spells, starting to write my own rituals using the same formats that I was used to, that I felt connected with from things that I had learned from books. So yeah, is it okay to make your own spells or rituals instead of only using those made by other people? Yes, it is, in my opinion. All of these things, of course, are from my perspective, my personal path and practice, and they will all depend on, you know, as I mentioned before briefly, if you are part of a specific tradition and that tradition has certain ways of doing things, then some of this might be a little bit more, you might do something in your personal practice and do another thing in group work within that tradition itself. But for my personal path and practice, this is how I'm answering everything, right? As always. So the next one, is it okay to work clothed and not just skyclad? Is it okay to work, to do ritual, to do spells with clothes on of any variety, be they specifically ritual clothes or street clothes? In my practice, yes, it is. There is a time and a place for skyclad work. It is not every time and every place. So definitely it is okay to work clothed in my type of practice. I have been part of many public rituals, for example, that are definitely clothed, and maybe people wear special garments, maybe people participate who are just wearing street clothes, whatever. And again, if you're part of a specific tradition and they typically work skyclad, that will be a different thing. You might choose to work a certain way with the group and a certain way on your own. Depends on your personal situation. This is another one we've talked about in the past on the Pagan Perspective collab channel, but not for a little while, but I've definitely done a video or two about it over the past 10 years. But is it okay to mix deities from different pantheons or different cultures? So in my personal practice, I tend not to do that because I think that it can be a little bit disrespectful. It can be a little bit presumptuous to just kind of take a god from one pantheon and culture and a goddess from a different pantheon and culture and call them into the same space and expect them to work together as a working pair when they're sort of from completely different realms and may not be interested in working together. I've also seen people say things like, if depending on the specific deities you're working with, for example, I've seen it given with Hecate. If someone's working with Hecate and they feel like they have to work with god-goddess pairs, Hecate does not traditionally need any type of male deity to be her consort or counterpart. So it can be a little bit disrespectful or even counterintuitive to try to throw, a Norse god in there as a partner to Hecate when she neither needs or wants that. So that's just one example I've seen other people give. So yeah, I tend to stay away from working with deities from different pantheons or cultures, especially in the same circle. However, it's not to say that you can't have a relationship with one deity from a certain pantheon and also a deity from another pantheon and maybe work with them separately. Maybe they each have their own altar, they each have their own devotional time. You call one of them into ritual and another into another type of ritual depending on what you're doing and whose energy or guidance you need at the time or who you want to be present at the time. But as far as bringing them into the same space, like trying to get two deities from two different cultures to like share one altar and be happy with that, they may not be happy with that, so your mileage may vary, but yeah, so I can't really say like, is it okay or not for everyone, obviously, but for my personal path, I tend to not do that because I think it can be a little bit disrespectful and a little bit presumptuous of me to assume who will get along with whom, who wants to work with whom, or who is willing to share and play nice with whom just because I say so. Another question I've seen come up a little bit is it okay to work with only the goddess or only the god? And again, that's going to be personal preference. That's your personal practice. To me, there was definitely a time in my practice where I focused more on the goddess because my upbringing was so God-centered and goddesses were not a thing. So I spent several years focusing mostly on getting to know what goddess has in store for my life and what goddess can bring and what I can learn from goddesses. And then I gradually added back in working with gods. So again, for example, if you are part of a tradition that traditionally works with god and goddess, then I would say that probably in the context of said tradition, it's not okay to focus on one and ignore the other because the tradition honors both. So it depends on what you're personally doing. But if you're just talking about your personal practice, it's your practice. For me personally, I work a lot with concepts of balance. To me, it was definitely important to take that time with just the goddess because I had been raised with just the god. So focusing on just goddess for me was a way of balancing out what I had not had in my life up to that point. But then once I got comfortable with it, I focus more on balance now. Is it okay to cast the circle widdershins, or counter sunwise, opposite the direction of the turning of the sun? In the northern hemisphere, that happens to be counterclockwise. In the southern hemisphere, counter sunwise is actually clockwise. I like to say sunwise and counter sunwise, or anti-sunwise, for that reason, because when we say clockwise and counterclockwise, that's very northern hemisphere centric and it leaves out all of our friends in the southern hemisphere. So I try to say sunwise. So is it okay to cast the circle anti-sunwise? When I was first learning and studying, again as a preteen, early teen, the stuff I was reading said, no, it is not okay to do that. And so that is what I believed for a time. As I have grown and progressed and gotten older, I now no longer agree with that. I don't believe that. I now believe, again, in my personal practice, that it is okay to cast a circle, widdershins, if there is a specific reason for doing so. So for me, for example, a waning moon or a dark moon circle might be better served by being cast widdershins and opened sunwise or jessel. Or for example, another thing that we may have read in sort of early beginner books is that while we are within the circle, we should always be walking in a sunwise or jessel direction. So in the northern hemisphere, that would be always going clockwise, always over our right shoulder. However, there are times within ritual where I feel that it does make sense to go counterclockwise, northern hemisphere, counter sunwise, or widdershins, such as when we are banishing things, when we are trying to decrease something. So in my practice, it is okay to cast circle widdershins, but it is only done for very specific reasons. Otherwise, I cast circle sunwise. Is it okay to have tools made of certain materials? This in particular, I think of that traditional idea of an athame that we read, that it has to be a double-edged blade, it has to be black-handled. So I work at the Buckland Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, and part of the museum collection is actually a smattering of athames that belonged to different people. We have some that belonged to Buckland and other members of Buckland's family and coven. We have an athame that belonged to Christopher Penzac. We also have one that belonged to Sybil Leek's grandmother. So I love having them, even though I personally, like, the athame or the ritual blade is not a huge part of my personal practice, but I love seeing them all there because I remember reading in all the early books, like, this is what an athame is. It is double-edged, it is black-handled. And just looking at all these ones that people from within our community, other authors, leaders, teachers, what they were actually using, there's such a wide variety. They're not all double-edged, they are not all black-handled, and some of them are even made entirely of wood. So one other thing that I think of as like a guideline for what our magic tools should be made of is, like, in Buckland's Big Blue Book, he talks about making sure that your tools that are intended to conduct energy, to direct energy, are made of a conductive material, because that just makes sense. So that's kind of a guideline that he used, although it was not, hard and fast. It's not a hard and fast rule. So for example, it makes sense to me that a lot of athames would be of a conductive metal blade, and that wands might be topped with a crystal that is good for directing energy. However, Sybil Leek's grandmother's athame is entirely made of wood, and that is a non-conductive material. However, it clearly worked for her. And I've also seen wands made of many different types of materials, and wood is a very common material for wands as well, even without a crystal or anything like that attached. So is it okay to have tools made of a certain material? I think depends on what your personal associations are with those materials and what those items are going to be used for. And ultimately, if it works for you, it works for you. If you feel that you can direct energy with a plain old stick, then great. I personally feel that that is perfectly doable and acceptable. So yeah, personally, I do think it is okay to have, for example, a one-edged blade that you use as an athame, or to have it be a different color, maybe a different color that speaks to you for how you want the energy to be represented. And then the last thing I have is it okay to pay teachers, artists, craftspeople, etc. in the magic realm? There is definitely this thing in pagan and witchy community where we say it's not okay to pay for magic, or that people should not charge you for magic. And it sometimes butts up against the idea of fairly compensating teachers or craftspeople for goods and services. I believe that it is okay and that it is important to pay people for goods and services. I believe that the main idea behind warning people that you shouldn't be paying for magic is that it's meant to make us wary of any groups that might be out there trying to swindle us. The people who might be saying, come and join our coven, the membership fee is only $100 a month, or $1,100 if you pay now for the whole year, something like that. Like, if they're trying to they're inviting you into their coven and, oh, look, it's only this amount of money, that I don't believe is right. I do not believe that we should be paying for membership or for initiation into a legitimate coven situation, into a magical community. But if someone is offering a class and they're charging for it, yes, I believe it is okay, and that it is important to pay them for their work, for their time, for their skill, their experience. It's not unlike taking any other type of class or an online course or anything like that. And of course, if we are going to buy something, this video started talking about, can we buy tarot decks? Can we buy tools? I think it is important if we go and we want to get those things made by other people. We want to get something from an artisan or craftsperson. It's important to pay them for that. And hopefully they are fair in their prices, but also making sure that they are being fairly compensated for their time, for their work, their experience, their skill. And also, if it's something that they do for a living, that they are enabling themselves to make a living doing it. I can tell you, as someone who kind of does the witchy thing full time, it's difficult making it actually pay you as though you are full time. So yeah, it's just come up a lot in my life recently because I do offer local classes and things like that. Some events have people come in as volunteer, and even if they travel a ways to get there, however many hours they've spent putting that workshop together or whatever, it's volunteer, and they make absolutely nothing out of doing it. They're doing it out of the kindness of their heart. They're doing it to spread their own work. They're doing it to help the community, whatever the case may be. But there are times that I can't necessarily travel to do such things on a volunteer basis because I have to pay bills. So there are other times where if we can't afford it at the time, that's a different story, and I totally relate to that because there are plenty of things that I look at them and I know that they are worth what the person is asking, or they are worth much more than what the person is asking, but I personally just can't afford it at the time, and that's different. Recognizing when we have to respect our own financial health and well-being and say no to something because it would be a little out of our budget at the time is different than saying that person's overcharging or what they're doing is simply not worth what they're asking. Because I do think that people's time and experience and skill is worth being compensated for. And I think that it is different than the warning that we do pose to people against those who would be out there looking to swindle us out of our hard-earned money. Yes, I think it is okay, especially to pay teachers for classes, artists for their art, craftspeople for their goods, for their wares, things like that. I don't think that it is right to charge someone for initiation. Like, yeah, I'll initiate you into this secret lineage, just pay me this amount of money. Like, I don't think that's ethical, personally. But yeah, I view them in separate categories from compensating people for goods and services. So that's something else relevant to my life, my personal path and practice. So yeah, thank you, Jenny, for asking this question. I do hope that this is a fun week because we all have the opportunity to kind of come up with some additional questions that are more relevant to our specific paths and practices. So a couple questions that we're all answering together, and then however many we come up with for more. I actually thought this was a short list. I could have continued going, but I thought, nope, that's going to be a long enough video just with those. So thank you so much for watching and or listening. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. You can answer some of these questions from your own personal path and practice. Do you think the things that I brought up are okay, or the things that Jenny gave as examples? How would you answer those questions for people from your personal path experience? Or do you have any of your own is it okay questions, and maybe you can help each other out and give each other your opinions in the comments. I will see you next time, and until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.